1948, one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of the 20th century began. Without telling a soul, Thaddeus Wilcox and his wife Fanny left their home in San Francisco, driving straight through for hours on end until they reached the Mojave Desert. Along with them was Fanny's younger sister Mabel, a woman who had not spoken a word since the age of 5 and who clung like a child to her doll Agatha. When officers searched the Wilcox home days later, they found the house completely intact and untouched. The three had left in the middle of the night with only the clothes on their backs, leaving behind everything and everyone they had ever known. A man of few words, Thaddeus had served in the Second World War. His closest friends report that he was never the same upon his return. He arrived home even more withdrawn and stoic than before. His wife Fanny herself had become quite pious in the years since her husband's return. In a former life, she had been a dancer, gracing the stages of various San Francisco nightclubs. Now she devoted her days to quiet prayer and reading sacred scripture. Compelled to start anew in the desert, Thaddeus spent his entire life savings purchasing a 100-acre plot of land known as Silent Creek. This included a small chapel and a cattle ranch. Thaddeus wasn't interested in running a farm, though, so he laid off all of the laborers. Before they were let go, he made them destroy his entire wealth of livestock. This, and what could only now be seen as a sacrificial offering to the unknown. Thaddeus, Fanny, and Mabel were said to have watched the slaughter of every animal on the property, totaling more than 500 beasts. It took 3 days for the workers to complete. The hours ticked by slowly. But for this family of 3, it was only a matter of time before their true designs for this land would be harnessed. Following the events that inevitably took place, investigators would scour what was left of the Silent Creek property, uncovering 3 corpses in the wreckage of the chapel's basement. What had become of the Wilcox family? After inexplicably moving to the Mojave Desert with his wife Fanny and her sister Mabel, Thaddeus Wilcox was now on a mission, though undefinable as yet, still a mission he felt compelled to see through due to an unknowable force. Restless, Thaddeus would wander the Silent Creek property every night, disappearing for hours on end in search of answers. One morning, his wife Fanny found him lying naked in a field, his clothing nowhere in sight. In a frantic state, he told her he had been sent a vision from above. According to Thaddeus, he had been contacted by beings from another dimension known as the Erendu. He believed he had been chosen by them to build a machine on this very land. This device would open a portal to the Erendu's dimension and allow them safe passage to Earth. But Thaddeus was crestfallen. He knew not where to begin. Fanny, on the other hand, received a revelation. As a young woman, she had been hospitalized for 6 months with a terrible affliction, thought to have been tuberculosis. 1 foot in the grave, she later recalled experiencing strange dreams of lighthouses. She would attribute these visions as a sign from God. She believed that his light was what led her back to the land of the living. But now she realized the full extent of her premonitions. The Wilcoxes needed this land to build their own lighthouse of the future. An interstellar beacon to guide the Erendu to Silent Creek. For the next few months, the couple used every resource they had, working tirelessly to design and construct their lighthouse machine, using only the divine inspiration from the Erendu's vision as their guide. Thaddeus even created a helmet to operate the machine under the extreme light and heat conditions that were expected once the portal was opened. Exactly 200 days after his initial vision, the machine was ready. The couple activated the device on the morning of February 13th, 1949, at 7:31 a.m. History was made. The lighthouse invention worked. A gateway to another dimension had appeared before them. What Thaddeus did not realize was that a second portal had also mysteriously opened, this one in New York City, and something wicked and vile had gazed through the door first. February 13th, 1949, Thaddeus Wilcox had opened a portal in the Mojave Desert using a lighthouse machine he had created based on designs from his wife Fanny's childhood fever dreams. All this in an effort to commune with a strange alien species he referred to as the Erendu. The machine worked. As some would later argue, it had worked all too well. According to Thaddeus, a portal had opened to the planet Erendu, but the erratic and unpredictable electromagnetic activity had also spawned a second anomaly on Varick Street in New York City, creating a divergence in the space-time continuum and what many speculate to be the genesis of a new timeline. Had no one happened upon this rogue gateway while it was open for 6 brief seconds, it has been said the lives of Thaddeus and Fanny would not have gone the direction they did. Unfortunately for them, this wormhole was discovered by someone who was the worst possible person who ever could have discovered it. A man named Angus Duquette, a man who would come to be known in various dimensions as the infamous clown with no paint on his face. A notorious serial killer who took either 20 or 200 lives, depending on which reality was being considered. Based on whisperings and loose reports, it can be estimated that Angus was born between the years 1918 and 1921. He was a son of Silas Duquette, a talented vaudeville and silent film actor known for his portrayals of clowns. From a very young age, Angus was infatuated with the idea of following in his father's footsteps. Silas, however, quelled this desire out of his own jealous insecurities. An abusive drunk, Silas was known to fall into frequent fits of rage, often lashing out at his son without warning, while Angus's mother Esme would get high on opium, doing nothing to help. At the age of 15, Angus reached a breaking point, killing his father by stabbing him to death with a fractured bottle of Old Grandad. Angus fled to New York, changing his name and seemingly disappearing into the void, only to return 15 years later in a terrifying new form. Not much is known about Angus Duquette's whereabouts between the time he fled his father's murder to when he finally re-emerged 15 years later under the nom de guerre, the clown with no paint on his face. What bits and pieces conspiracists have managed to assemble indicate that Angus worked at a carnival, pursuing a failed career as a clown. As fate would have it, Angus suffered a rare skin allergy that prevented him from wearing makeup, hence the reason why he would later be known as the clown with no paint on his face. The few murders that can be definitively attributed to the clown in the reality before Thaddeus and Fanny unwittingly opened the second gateway are as follows. Molly Jean Monroe and her best friend Charity St. Pierre, Bart Hewlett and his twin brother Samuel, Oda and Ollie Hammersmith, Agnes Henry, Herbie Petrovich and Peter Herbovich, Chief Roy Briggs, the Krukow family consisting of Gertie, Doris, Josephine, Beatrice, Melvin, Melvin's wife Suzette, Melvin's brother Michael, Florence the housekeeper, Melvin Jr., and Melvin Jr.'s dog Winston. On the night of February 12th, Angus killed his last victim in the former timeline, a young starlet named Claire Valparaiso. Her body was uncovered behind what is now the Empire Theater. The morning after Claire's murder, Thaddeus Wilcox's invention tore a hole in the fabric of time, opening a window for Angus to peer through. He saw his future. It was in the Mojave Desert. Angus left the flophouse he was staying in and hopped the next train he could find headed west. He was on his way to fulfill his destiny in becoming the most heinous serial killer the world we live in would never know. February 13th, 1949, the day that Thaddeus Wilcox opened the portal to commune with the Erendu, but unwittingly summoned notorious serial killer Angus Duquette, known as the clown with no paint on his face, was also the day something equally miraculous happened. Fanny Wilcox's younger sister, Mabel, who had not spoken a word since the age of 5 and who permanently clung to her doll Agatha, would finally speak. The word or name she uttered was unmistakable. It was simply Agatha. She stated it once, this at the moment the portal opened, only to be heard by her sister Fanny and no one else. It was brief and fleeting, but nonetheless, Mabel had broken her decades of silence. Mabel had been a happy child, a lover of animals and her teddy bear. She grew up on her parents' farm, always looking up to her sister Fanny. At the moment when Fanny came down with a mysterious illness thought to be tuberculosis and was brought to a hospital ward several hours away, Mabel's parents, Clyde and Eleanor, became increasingly fearful of germs. They would force a strict cleanliness regimen upon their second daughter. Eventually, the fear that she would contract something potentially deadly and infect them became too much to bear. They decided to build a tent outside their home where Mabel was to remain in quarantine. The parents even went so far as to hire a full-time nanny and caretaker to look after the child during this period. Despite the circumstances, Mabel retained a cheery disposition, that is, until the nanny arrived and things began to turn for her. The nanny's name was Agatha Carruthers. She was a stern and harsh woman from the North Country, whose only act of kindness to Mabel was gifting her a doll upon their meeting, a doll which Mabel aptly named Agatha. That was the extent of Agatha's cordiality. As Mabel would soon discover, her caretaker lived a double life. A practitioner of the dark arts, Agatha engaged nightly in the occult and was, for all intents and purposes, a witch. Mabel frequently witnessed her governess stalking the grounds of the family's property, holding conversations with herself for hours on end. At one point, Mabel followed her to a nearby cemetery and watched as Agatha held a strange candlelit ceremony, communing with spirits of the wicked. To Mabel's terror, Agatha caught her spying, and by means of a horrible tongue-lashing, Mabel learned Agatha's true intentions for why she took this job in the first place. Agatha wished to be young again, so she had dabbled in the dark practice of soul-swapping in the hopes of inhabiting Mabel's body. The petrified child tried to warn her parents of Agatha's cruel designs, but her protestations went unheeded, and on a stormy October night, Agatha Carruthers chanted the evil rites and hung herself with her bedsheet not 3 feet from Mabel's bedside. In the following weeks, the former cheerily dispositioned young Mabel became sullen and quiet. She had stopped talking altogether. The doctors ran a multitude of tests, tried various speech therapies and experimental procedures, but no matter what they attempted, they could not get the child to speak again. In the coming years, many would attribute Mabel's silence to this childhood trauma of Agatha's suicide, but they would never discover the unknowable truth that Agatha's curse had both backfired and been successful. Through death, Agatha had failed to possess the child, her aged evil soul disappearing beyond the astral plane. Unfortunately for Mabel, her own soul became corporeally untethered and was transmuted into the doll. From that point on, Mabel was an empty vessel, puppeted by the very puppet that never left her fingers. Her body was now nothing more than a grown-up teddy bear, like the ones Mabel adored as a child. But now, with the opening of the portal, Fanny interpreted this utterance of a single word as a sign that Mabel finally had something besides the doll to grasp onto: hope. Unfortunately, Fanny couldn't see the full picture at that moment in time, that her sister's word was less a miracle and more a harbinger of doom. And like the day many years ago when Mabel tried to warn her family of the evil that would befall her, she was doing it again, once more. It took Angus Duquette 3 weeks to travel across the country by train, hopping from rail line to rail line. Like Thaddeus Wilcox, he was impelled by a force from an unknown dimension to get to the Mojave Desert. But still, he could not resist his nature as a notorious serial killer, the clown with no paint on his face. Instead of speeding his way west, Angus took his time, changed his appearance, shaving his beard, cutting his hair, donning a top hat, and delighted in his own warped sense of hijinks, playing sadistic tricks on anyone and everyone he could. Some conductors reported a strange figure advancing towards their train, riding atop an old handcar, engaged in what could only be described in modern times as a nightmarish game of chicken. Passengers on the commercial rail lines frequently complained of a man who would come into their sleeping cars at night and watch them as they lay in their cots. But many of the warnings went unheeded and were largely dismissed. On the morning of February 19th, Loretta Beauregard left the Abilene Union Pacific Passenger Depot in Missouri for her long trek home on foot. Loretta didn't realize that she was being followed. Angus waited for the perfect moment to strike. He viciously assaulted her, leaving her for dead on the tracks. She would have died a brutal death that day had one of the rail crew not seen her and made a daring rescue at the last possible second. Angus was having fun making these frequent detours and pit stops. One could argue too much fun, that he had lost the momentum. The last train Angus hopped was perhaps the most serendipitous, however. It was a traveling carnival. On board here, he met Guntherson the Enigmatic, a wizened psychic who immediately recognized darkness in Angus. Having encountered many a broken soul at the carnival, Guntherson tried his best to draw Angus to the light. He convinced Angus to help the carnival set up on the fairgrounds in the small town of Last Chance, Colorado. Angus stayed on, working for Guntherson the Enigmatic, viewing him as the father he never had. He then developed a romance with a magician's assistant, and for a time, actually began having second thoughts about leaving. Perhaps his mission to Silent Creek would have been permanently derailed were it not for a fateful night when Angus peered into Guntherson's crystal ball. That's when he caught his first glimpse of the Erendu, and the interdimensional power that was awaiting him to unlock if he kept heading west. Seeing this vision resurrected the darkness inside him. It made him angry with himself for wasting all this time with senseless detours. The clown with no paint on his face strangled Guntherson the Enigmatic. When he stepped out from the tent, Angus was no longer a trickster, but a full-blown monster. Angus would murder the entire band of carnival workers in their sleep, this number totaling 157 souls. He then released the lions from their cages. From this point onward, he decided he had had enough with trains. Angus was determined to walk the rest of the way to Silent Creek. Several days had passed since Thaddeus Wilcox opened up a portal on the Silent Creek property using a lighthouse machine based on designs from visions of his wife, Fanny. The portal had come and gone in a flash. Fanny's sister had allegedly uttered the word Agatha, but other than this minor miracle, the Erendu had failed to come. Thaddeus grew increasingly despondent and frustrated by their absence. He started to believe the designs were faulty and that maybe he needed more cattle to sacrifice. Having read an abundance of ancient history as a young man and studied many of the great civilizations of antiquity, Thaddeus decided the answer lay in Mexico, at the site of the ancient ruins of Teotihuacan, a city built around its relationship to the constellations. Thaddeus hired Thora Bell Buchanan III, an intrepid pilot known for her wild exploits and tales of daring do, and chartered a plane straight away for Mexico City. At the site of Teotihuacan, Thaddeus walked the Calle de los Muertos as he would wander his own property at Silent Creek. He arrived at the base of the Temple of the Sun, where he waited for inspiration. He stood there at high noon when the sun was at its zenith. Still, to his chagrin, nothing was revealed to him. Not wanting to admit he had journeyed all this way for naught, he decided to remain in Mexico until he received a new message from the Erendu. It's during this time that I would first meet Thaddeus. Back at Silent Creek, Fanny was experiencing visions of her own. She had been taken ill by a mysterious sickness, not dissimilar to tuberculosis which she had endured as a child, and now confined herself to her room where she lay bedridden. Each night that Thaddeus was away, she would undergo vivid fever dreams which she would document with her typewriter each morning. On the first night, she dreamt of being a young girl, trapped in her childhood bedroom, a youthful version of Thaddeus then rescuing her, taking her far away from danger. Apparently safe, she then inflated a balloon to fly to the stars, only to have her father shoot her balloon down where she fell back to Earth. Enraged, her father then proceeded to shoot the moon. On the second night, she dreamt of eyes. On the third night, she dreamt of stairs. She ascended these never-ending steps, climbing higher and higher as if to somewhere unknown. She thought maybe they were leading her to God and heaven. On the fourth night, she dreamed of hands, at first caressing her husband's hands in a tender embrace. But then the hands struggled, as if drowning. clasping to hold onto each other before it was too late. On the 5th night, she dreamt of geometric shapes. On the 6th night, she had no dreams. On the 7th night, she dreamt of hell. Fanny awoke in a cold sweat and immediately sent word to Thaddeus in Mexico. Thaddeus, however, was not in his hotel room. His mission to regain contact with the Erendu now proving fruitless, he had spent his last few nights on drunken benders frequenting the city bars and underground cockfight tournaments. When he returned to the hotel at 4 a.m., he quickly sobered upon seeing the dire telegram his wife had left for him. He conscripted Thorabelle Buchanan III to fly him home at dawn's first light. To his horror, Thaddeus learned that Thorabelle Buchanan III had tragically died in a fatal crash the day prior. Thaddeus needed to find a way to return to his family as soon as possible. Evil was on its way to Silent Creek, and Thaddeus needed to prepare for it. In the immediate aftermath of the notorious Carnival massacre in the town of Last Chance, Colorado, that left more than 157 carnival workers dead, the serial killer Angus Duquette, also known as a clown with no paint on his face, had finally begun to create a nationwide panic. One of the biggest manhunts in history was carried out in what many were now calling the worst crime of the century. Investigators worked tirelessly, turning up hundreds of leads. All leads, however, ultimately became dead ends. Newspapers printed non-stop front-page coverage, but none of it unearthed any clue or hint as to the killer's current whereabouts. As the days dragged on with Angus still not found, the country only grew more terrified, and the specter of his evil loomed large. Rumors spread that he was traveling with the Pride of Lions, a detail that unsettled scores of people. Every town within a 1,000-mile vicinity began to fear that they could be the next unlucky place where Angus would pay a deadly visit. Many wealthy residents went so far as to hire out members from the local police forces to safeguard their homes at night. The result of this was as expected. Pressure mounted on state legislators to do something. A curfew was set in place, police patrolled neighborhoods more frequently, and local air raid sirens that were designated for nuclear disaster were repurposed for daily Angus alerts. These were a series of announcements meant to warn citizens of possible Angus sightings or attacks. Local organized crime outfits even called temporary truces with the police in an effort to work together until the killer was apprehended. Schools put into place safety measures of their own, and many students were encouraged to no longer walk home alone, but to travel in groups. Any personage resembling a clown, including those employing behaviors of a jokester, was not to be trusted. Children were instructed to report these suspects immediately to their elders. Teenagers going on dates were advised not to frequent any place that might have some element of silliness or carnivalesque attraction. Leaders did their best to put the public's mind at ease, but it was too late. A full-blown hysteria had indeed consumed the hearts and minds of these communities. There was but one other prime suspect early on, Herman Witherby, the sole survivor of the Carnival massacre. Having been born with an irregular skin condition, Herman traveled as one of the sideshow acts. On the night of the massacre, Herman was passed out in an empty rattlesnake basket, inebriated on poorly brewed moonshine. Ironically, that terrible moonshine spared him a brutal death. After awaking to discover that everyone he knew had been savagely murdered, Herman fled the scene in fear. He was apprehended hours later after attempting to appeal to a local woman of skittish demeanor for help. The police interrogated him for a grueling period of time before ultimately releasing him with minor vagrancy charges. Despite being cleared of any suspicion, Herman's appearance and sordid lifestyle was reviled by much of the puritanical masses. He became a scapegoat. Years later, Hollywood cinematic depictions of Angus Duquette would have been imbued with qualities more akin to Herman than the real Angus, further exacerbating this false and misleading lie. By the time history would look differently upon Herman, he would be long dead, buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field. But perhaps the most disturbing outcome of the Carnival massacre was the wave of copycat killings it precipitated. In the days that followed, homicides seemed to be happening everywhere. Many of these killings were inspired by Angus's roots and now mythic backstory as the sad clown that could not even become a proper clown. Copycats took his stripped-down iconography and embellished it in highly garish ways. Gerald the Top Hat and Samuel the Smiler were perhaps the best known of this pack. Each destined to kill but a handful of people before their sloppiness would get the best of them. But some experts theorize that these murders could also be claimed as potential Angus victims, as they would fall along the most likely route he was traveling. The hard truth is that we will never know. Through all this time of pain and darkness, one thing was clear. Angus had disappeared. He had left no trace and no trail as he quietly made his way to Silent Creek on foot. Had Angus gone into hiding for the rest of his life, he would have left a permanent scar on the collective unconscious. But he had an unknowable purpose awaiting him in the Mojave Desert, his magnum opus. Days had passed since Fanny had sent the urgent message to her husband Thaddeus Wilcox, beseeching him to return to the Silent Creek property immediately. But things were not looking good. There had been no sign of him or update on his progress. Fanny grew more fretful by the hour and now spent each day pacing the grounds, praying for him to return home soon. Thaddeus, for his part, went to great lengths to find a way back. After the untimely death of his pilot Thorabel Buchanan III, Thaddeus had acquired a small motorbike from a local teenager in Mexico City and was racing across the countryside as fast as the engine permitted. On his sojourn, he rode through a quaint villa outside Guadalajara, where he stopped for lunch at a small commune of expatriates. After hearing the story of Thaddeus's woes, the expats implored Thaddeus to bathe in the waters of their pool in the back courtyard. The answers to everything he was looking for were said to be under the surface, as the pool was known to have mystical vision-inducing properties. In actuality, the expats had filled the water with several kilograms of LSD, and moments after Thaddeus dove headfirst into the pool, his body went into a state of shock. Unprepared for the amount of psychedelic immediately introduced to his system, he was pulled out of the water, but was now in a temporary state of catatonia. While Thaddeus convalesced in a remote Mexican hospital, Angus Duquette, also known as the clown with no paint on his face, had quietly made his way onto the Silent Creek property to no fanfare. At long last, he had arrived. Angus silently lurked about the area, taking stock of the Wilcox home and the impressive lighthouse machine that had been constructed with the hope of summoning the Erendu. That hope now seemingly a failure. As he stalked the land in secret, Angus made a stunning realization. The Erendu were indeed here. They had arrived at Silent Creek weeks ago, on the day that Thaddeus first operated the machine. They had come through the portal, traveling light years through the cosmos, in the form of a single-cell organism that had grown and replicated over time. This was what had infected Fanny with her mysterious week-long sickness, similar to tuberculosis, and caused her recent spell of fever dreams. By now, the microscopic Erendu cells had attached themselves to some of the local wildlife, using their bodies as hosts. Angus secured several contaminated mourning doves, swaddled them in cloth, and smuggled them into the chapel's basement. For the next few days, he would make hourly visits to tend and nurture the developing parasites, making sure to avoid detection by Fanny and Mabel above, while providing the Erendu with more sickly birds. This gestation period in the dark recesses of the basement allowed the strange parasitic organism feeding off the birds to grow, and grow they did. The Erendu matured at a rapid rate, their interdimensional powers becoming incredibly strong. As is theorized, the Erendu were extremely volatile beings that had the unpredictable capability to create rifts in the fabric of time and space. These properties were further enhanced by the highly unstable electromagnetic activity that had recently occupied Silent Creek. Several intermittent microevents occurred wherein various dimensions, including the astral plane, folded into one shared reality. Entities that were free-floating in a realm not bound to the rules of physics were now materializing into a tangible state at Silent Creek. Lucky for the family Wilcox, most of the ethereal plasma vaporized instantly in the atmosphere. Unlucky for the family Wilcox, one malevolent spirit had indeed been hovering above Fanny's younger sister Mabel for years, untethered in an adjacent plane, waiting for a second chance at life. And now, that opportunity presented itself. Agatha Carruthers had returned. Devreux E. Mallarme was a Parisian filmmaker who had struggled to find success in the States. He lived in Hoosick Falls, New York, and made silent films of bodybuilders. These exhibited frequently at county fairs and carnivals. There is a good chance Angus Duquette would have seen his work, but never known its creator. Devreux had a second career as a veterinarian and treated his beloved pets as family. There was his dog Gustave, his cat Cousteau, his cow Periwinkle, his penguin Orson, and his chimpanzee Fred Sims, who also doubled as his trusty camera operator. Devreux had heard the story of Angus's killing spree, but was even more disturbed by the unfounded reports that Angus had been traveling with a pack of lions. He loathed the thought of animal cruelty and detested the man all the more for it. But it wasn't until a stray bird flew to his window one night that Devreux would soon find himself on a direct course to Angus. After translating the bird's squawks, Devreux learned that it had flown all the way from Silent Creek and was seeking someone to alert the authorities of the dark tides that would be coming. Instead of acting upon this frantic request, Devreux ignored it, realizing he had been given the story of the lifetime and he wasn't going to waste it. At long last, Devreux was going to make a real film of great importance. He was going to document whatever cataclysmic event took place at Silent Creek and make cinematic history. The next morning, Devreux said goodbye to his animals, leaving them under the care of Fred Sims. He packed up his car and set out alone on a journey to the Mojave Desert, navigating this journey by way of the sun and the bird's sketchy directions. On a chilly morning in April 1949, Fanny Wilcox awoke to the sound of her sister Mabel's voice, speaking in clipped, broken sentences, a sound she had not heard in years. Mabel had miraculously regained the ability to talk. As is theorized, one of the mysterious micro-events that had occurred the day prior as a byproduct of the Erendu's ongoing maturation had created a hole in this dimension, allowing Mabel's soul, which had been trapped in her doll since her caretaker Agatha Carruthers' suicide curse went horribly wrong, to find its way back to her body. Fanny and Mabel rejoiced after being made whole once again. However, the happiness would be short-lived, for Fanny had a sudden flash of horrible eyes. This, amid other visions denoting impending death and destruction. Fanny knew something was terribly wrong. When the sisters heard an awful cackling sound coming from the basement, Fanny realized she had misinterpreted her recent fever dream involving stairs. Instead of ascending to heaven, she was meant to do just the reverse. She and her newly returned sister crept down the chapel stairs together into the depths of the basement. That's when they found the witch, Agatha Carruthers, awaiting them. Agatha attacked the sisters in a vicious assault. Up above, Angus Duquette had climbed the scaffolding on the side of the lighthouse machine and was trying to harness the untamed power the Erendu had been generating and channel it into himself. An electrical storm began. Angus was unable to control the massive amount of energy now flowing through the air. He was struck by lightning and fell from the great height. Angus picked himself up, realizing that he needed to return to the basement, bring out one of the Erendu, and try again. But with all the chaos caused by the electromagnetic storm, a fire had started and the property was now in flames. Down in the chapel basement, Fanny and Mabel used this momentary distraction to overpower Agatha and tie her to a support beam. It's at this point where details become murky. It is said that as the sisters were making an escape, Angus appeared, forcing them back downstairs at knife point. Angus then called for the Erendu to come to him. Still not fully developed, however, the Erendu believed Angus posed a threat. They flew out from the walls where they were hiding and overwhelmed him, devouring his flesh from bone. As Angus's life flickered, he realized the full extent of their betrayal. The Erendu had made false promises of a magnificent power that was meant for them and only them. Angus died on the cold floor, knowing he was nothing more than a servant for their bidding. And now he was no longer needed. The Erendu were about to turn their sights on Fanny and Mabel when a shot rang out, blasting the small alien creatures to hell. It was Thaddeus. He had serendipitously awoken from his drug-induced catatonic state the day before at the moment when the micro-event had quietly rippled through Silent Creek. He grabbed hold of his wife Fanny and her sister Mabel, and the three of them fled the fiery grounds, not looking back as Agatha burned alive as would a witch burning at the stake. The blaze lasted through the night, destroying the entire Silent Creek ranch. In the coming months and years, little would be found in the wreckage. The ranch, the chapel, and the lighthouse machine had completely burned to ash. The only artifacts that would ever be uncovered would be 3 mysterious skeletons in the chapel basement. It is believed that Angus Duquette and Agatha Carruthers were 2 of these skeletons, but the remains of the 3rd has caused frequent speculation and debate. It wasn't until years later that an anthropologist would interview Fred Sims and learn of Devreux Mallarme's doomed mission to Silent Creek. What can only be inferred is that at some point while Thaddeus, Fanny, and Mabel were making their escape, Devreux Mallarme had descended into the basement of the burning chapel with camera in hand, only to find he had arrived at the worst possible time. This unassuming and little-known Parisian documentary filmmaker became trapped in the blaze and died alongside 2 terrible monsters. He would be all but forgotten by history outside his beloved animals. With the death of the Erendu, time and reality were in a state of erratic flux for days. This caused many people to immediately forget the name of the notorious Angus Duquette, also known as the clown with no paint on his face. The horrific events of the Carnival Massacre becoming a minor blip in history with no explanation. The majority of the world would also never know the truth of Silent Creek nor the story of the Wilcox family. The whereabouts of the latter a genuine mystery to most. That is until 1965, when Fanny Wilcox resurfaced with a mysterious illness thought to be tuberculosis for the 3rd and final time in her life. Now on her deathbed, in a moment of epiphany, Fanny came to realize that the Erendu had chosen her, not her husband Thaddeus, to ensure the survival of their species. Not bound to the ordinary rules of time and reality, they had existed as a time-traveling germ, caught in a loop between her childhood affliction and the disaster at Silent Creek. After failing each time to survive the 1949 fire, they always returned back to the past to reinfect Fanny as a child with the fever dreams that would later inspire the lighthouse machine, which would open the gateway to planet Erendu. But their mission to reach their final form on Earth was unsuccessful in every reality. Now, having infected Fanny at the end of her life, she knew that something had changed. Instead of reverting to the past, Fanny warned her nurses that the Erendu were now looking to the future. She didn't know when they would fully return, but she knew it was only a matter of time. To this day, the Erendu have yet to make their second coming. One can either accept Fanny's account as the ramblings of a woman losing her mind, or a premonitory warning of the end times. Fanny died peacefully in her sleep hours after recounting her story to me. I would not have believed a word she said had I not already heard bits and pieces of the same story many years ago in Mexico from her husband Thaddeus, who I initially had written off as an eccentric teller of tall tales. It didn't make sense to me at the time, but now I had learned the full picture. Fanny's soul then floated freely, making its final journey into the unknowable.